Our next speaker is Leila Zanouzi. She is a PhD student here at UCSB in the Department of Global and International Studies. She is planning to write her dissertation on the Iranian diasporic literature studying female writers in the United States. She is particularly interested in studying how Iranian women are represented in the United States and how they represent Iran in their writing. She has earned her Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Chatham University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her thesis was a short novel about 3 Iranian women's journeys of resisting patriarchy in Tehran. In the 3 years she has been in the U.S., Leila has partaken in numerous panels and conferences such as the Association of Global Studies, discussing Iran and the Iranian diaspora.
Thank you, Jessie. Hi, everyone. My talk will be, it can be divided into 3 parts. The first part I will talk about background of sexual education in Iran. The second part will preface the changes that took part in 2013, which I believe was pretty radical. And then the last part I will talk about how scholars have reshaped their approach to advocating for sexual education in school systems, the school curricula in Iran. And it's going to be hopefully interesting. Millennials in Iran, or the 3rd generation of the revolution, as they're called, grew up with parents who continued the trend of body shaming and sexuality tabooing, the attitude which has been part of the Iranian family for generations. But as the Iranian society progresses and most the internet became accessible to all, millennials realized that sexuality should not be a cause of shame. However, without proper resources and guidance, which is the case in Iran, scholars predict that children will fall in the well of assault and sexual violence. To this end, recently, scholars in the medical fields and curriculum studies are urging schools to educate teachers and parents to acknowledge children's sexualities and help them become more comfortable with their bodies and needs. In order for their suggestions to be accepted and adopted by the Islamic country, these scholars are utilizing Islamic texts and resources to argue that Islam also wishes sexuality to be addressed and celebrated. In this presentation, I will start by giving a short background on sexual education in Iran and then talk about the series of fundamental changes in the educational system that took part in 2013. By prefacing the above-mentioned events, I will then argue that because of the changes of the society over the past 5 years, scholars have been galvanized to write papers and organize conferences on the necessity of sexual education in the school curricula, naturally shaped by the teachings of Islam and the Prophet. Scholars channel their revolutionary ideas by arguing, quote, in the age of media and technology, the gap between adolescence and marriage has widened, and therefore youth need to be informed and educated about sexual hygiene, sexual identity, wholesome personal growth, and concretization of the institution of marriage. This is quoted by Shafi'i, 2014. As for the background, after the population boost of the early 1960s, the government realized that they had to take action in family planning programs, and it commenced in 1967. In that program, the government distributed free contraceptives and condoms, especially in rural areas. The program had gained significant traction in the early 70s with millions of government funds allocated to women's health. However, with the Islamic Revolution, this program was halted and was in a process of hiatus. In 1980, Ayatollah Khomeini, the revolutionary leader, declared that if women's lives would not be endangered because of using contraceptives and their husbands do not object to their wives using contraceptives, he will allow the redistribution of IUDs, contraceptives, and condoms countrywide. Alongside family planning programs, the history of premarital classes in Iran dates back to 1994, when the UN Conference on Population and Development in Cairo demanded all countries to develop a plan of action to increase public awareness based on reproductive rights. Ever since this plan of action, there has been mandatory premarital classes in Iran free of charge for couples engaged to be married. These classes have been held in select hospitals, and in which doctors and nurses discussed reproductive rights, reproductive organs, and reproductive health and contraceptive methods. As a complement to this premarital classes, in 2011, a much-needed DVD was distributed in pharmacies all across the country called The Familiar Beloved, marketed as a guide to marital relations and sexual hygiene, the untold facts about sexuality for adults only. In this DVD, presented as a conversation with experienced doctors of the field, the material discussed is framed around the Prophet's saying. In the DVD, the topic of sexual pleasure is greatly emphasized, a matter that has long been taboo in Iran. While such progress was promising, bringing hope for a healthy life to many Iranians, there still was a lack of dialogue on the importance of sexual education courses in schools, where adolescents could learn about puberty and sexual health. It can be argued that the year of 2013 marked a significant shift in sexual health programs in Iran. Although the country still suffered from high divorce rates, the changes implemented in 2013 hinted that the government feared an open country in which conversation about sexuality and sexual health were no longer a taboo. In early 2013, the Supreme Leader called for a population growth in one of his public speeches, urging the Iranian families to have 4 or more children. Ayatollah Khamenei remarked on how the country needed to put an end to the family planning programs, which encouraged the use of contraceptive pills, ricocheted all across the country. This is why medical science scholars argue that although Islam is essentially against population control, Islamic philosophy suggests that if a country or a government is not economically or culturally competent to provide for its own population growth, population growth is unethical. But such expressions of concern did not stop the ricocheting of Khamenei's remarks. Following the Supreme Leader's speech, the ad campaign called "There Will Be No Spring with One Child" swept the cities with its animation billboards illustrating families with 1 child as miserable and those with 4 children as active and celebrating life. In the same year, there were talks of reformatting the college-level course Family Planning, which focused mostly on contraceptive and preventative methods. The course that was pitched to replace this course was The Psychology of Marriage and the Glory of Spousehood. This was said to have excluded all subjects on sexuality. The restructuring was almost finalized in 2013, yet it was halted and eventually shut down in 2014, thank God, when the Ministry of Education claimed that they need to do more research on the subject and that the curriculum will be slightly edited, but mostly remain the same. Alongside the ad campaign and the changes in the university-level educational course, with little public notice, the first grade through pre-university school structure changed to a K-12 school system. Comparing the differences between the contents from the 80s and 90s with this new textbooks, we can notice the religious undertones of this new textbook. By restructuring the school system, the Islamic Republic gained ample pretext to purge all these textbooks from any un-Islamic material. In contrast to the background turn of the regime, especially in regard to school curricula, the society was showing signs of readiness and great need for rigorous sexual education. And this will be reflected in the surveys that I'm going to talk about. It is worth mentioning that prior to 2013, papers stressed on the importance of sexual education in general. But right after these radical changes, the papers were talking about how absolutely necessary to include sexual education in elementary schools. Mohammadi et al. Conducted a study in 2002 in Tehran, which sought to understand the reproductive knowledge and attitudes and behavior among adolescent males. The results of this research showed that 28% of the adolescent boys between the ages of 15 and 18 reported having engaged in sexual activities. This is while their knowledge of contraceptive methods, sexually transmitted disease, and STDs were significantly low. Despite the common belief that sexual education may lead to encouraging adolescents to involve in sexual activities, scholars like Latif Nejad et al. 2013 sought to prove that the lack of sexual education not only does not prevent adolescents from having sexual relations, but it shapes and consolidates incorrect beliefs and false information. Latif Nejad 2013. Without sexual education, Latif Nejad and colleagues argue adolescents are bound to turn to pornographic magazines, provocative websites, and television shows in order to receive information about sexual relations. To address such issues, Latif Nejad et al. State that clerics themselves refer to Prophet and Imam's teaching in discussing the necessity of sexual education to Muslims, since sexual desire is believed to be a gift from God from which humans should properly benefit. In another survey, Shafi'i and colleagues 2014 interviewed students and teachers and deduced that both teachers and students agreed that it's very important to include sexual education in school curricula. Teachers believe the necessity of including information about Islamic covering of the body, the importance of informing adolescents about abiding by religious and jurisprudence of Sharia Islam, especially regarding girls and boys, and informing students about characteristics of puberty and adolescence. This is why most students wish to learn more about the characteristics of puberty, what they should expect when they hit puberty, the outcomes of puberty, and how to control their sexual desires. Curriculum studies scholar Saodat Fard et al. 2016 believe that by teaching adolescent youth about Islam's spiritual practices, we can then provide the proper guidance for this innate sexual desire in the framework of societal rules, chastity, faith, and ethics. Only then we can have healthy families who bring us peace of mind and soul. Other curriculum studies scholars like Islamian et al. 2015 presented an Islam-friendly approach to sexual education. Islamian et al. Stated that most important and most repeated goals of sexual education should be safeguarding adolescents' chastity, preventing them from perversion, and having a healthy society. They argue that school curricula should only focus on spirituality and theological teachings. The main outcome of such courses should be teaching students ways to control and diminish their sexual desires, retain hygiene in puberty, and give information on sexual dangers and diseases. Afshar Kohan and colleagues point out that sex education in elementary school is a neglected part of the curriculum. Sexuality, Afshar Kohan argue, has long been sanctioned from discussions, and they conclude that sexual desire is one of the most powerful human desires which impacts salvation on earth and afterlife. Hence, they argue that if this desire is not guided by fitra and as God intended, people will be lured into corruption and ruin. So we can see that these scholars are trying to caution the government into really considering having sexual education in the school curricula. In conclusion, we can deduce that the 39 years after the Islamic Revolution, scholars are apprehensive that the sexual repression can still hinder students and children from searching the internet for sexual education. There's no denying the fact that Iran's societal sphere has drastically changed recently, mostly due to having internet access. Because of this, scholars are urging the inclusion of sexual education in school curricula, whether middle school or elementary school, but this is why the system is rejecting this idea, as demonstrated by the events took place in 2013. As a reaction to the backward steps taken by the government, scholars wish to bring the government's attention to the benefits of sexual education with an Islamic framework, of course. According to the scholarships on these issues, there are multiple ways to include sexual education in school curricula, which adheres to Islamic doctrine and philosophy. Some scholars mention that Islam wishes people to celebrate their sexual desire, but at the same time curb it according to societal rules of conduct. They also believe that Islam provides the perfect framework for teaching sexual health and education. This is why other scholars simply use the framework of Islam so that the government officials would pay attention to the importance of their message. Considering the radical changes the country has gone through over the past 30 years of the revolution, the previous coercive measures to silence this desire can no longer work. Scholars wish for the government to come to terms with the issue and take appropriate steps. However, with the efforts of the regime in 2013, scholars need to double down or even triple down their efforts so that sexual education can be part of school curricula in the near future. Thank you.